The roots of corruption in Africa can be traced back to the colonial era. The corruptors of the African leaders are still empowering the new African corrupt leaders to serve their masters. Unveiling the shadows, Africa's struggle against Western economic exploitation and corruption. The narrative of Africa's historical exploitation is intricately linked with the pervasive issue of corruption, with Western powers often portrayed as facilitators of this phenomenon. As Africa navigates the path to self-determination and economic empowerment, a critical aspect of this journey is the examination of corruption and its impact on the continent. This essay delves into the historical details of how corruption, often perpetuated by Western entities, has played a role in hindering Africa's development. Historical roots of corruption. The roots of corruption in Africa can be traced back to the colonial era, where exploitative practices were institutionalized and local elites collaborated with colonial powers for personal gain. The legacy of corruption continued post-independence, as new leaders sometimes inherited corrupt systems or succumbed to the allure of personal enrichment. Western powers, with their economic interests in Africa, often turned a blind eye to corrupt practices within local governments as long as it served their strategic objectives. Neocolonial influences. In the post-colonial era, neocolonialism became a subtle form of control wherein Western nations continued to exert influence over African economies and politics. Multinational corporations, often with Western roots, engaged in exploitative practices, taking advantage of weak regulatory frameworks and corrupt officials. The extraction of resources, tax evasion, and illicit financial flows became common, siphoning off wealth from African nations and perpetuating cycles of poverty. The role of multinational corporations. Multinational corporations, often operating with Western origins, have been implicated in corrupt practices that have had severe repercussions for Africa. Unfair trade agreements, tax evasion, and bribery have been used as tools to maintain control over valuable resources. This economic exploitation not only widens the wealth gap but also hinders the development of sustainable industries within Africa. International financial institutions. International financial institutions, influenced by Western powers, have sometimes imposed structural adjustment programs that prioritize economic liberalization over social development. These policies, while purportedly aimed at fostering economic growth, have often exacerbated poverty and inequality. The conditions attached to loans and aid packages have sometimes led to corrupt practices within African governments as leaders seek to secure funds for their nations at the expense of transparency and accountability. Civil society and anti-corruption movements. Despite the challenges, Africa has seen the rise of vibrant civil society movements and organizations dedicated to combating corruption. These movements are increasingly holding both local and foreign entities accountable for their actions. Calls for transparency, accountability, and responsible governance are gaining momentum, challenging the entrenched systems that have allowed corruption to persist. Moving forward. The fight against corruption in Africa requires a multifaceted approach that addresses both internal and external factors. African nations are increasingly adopting measures to strengthen institutions, enhance transparency, and prosecute corrupt individuals. The international community, particularly Western nations, must play a role in supporting these efforts by promoting fair trade practices, responsible investment, and ethical corporate behavior. Conclusion. As Africa strives for economic empowerment and self-determination, the issue of corruption cannot be ignored. By acknowledging historical injustices and holding both local and Western entities accountable, Africa can pave the way for a future that is free from the shackles of corruption. Collaboration between African nations and the international community is essential to foster an environment where economic growth is inclusive, sustainable, and just.